She was barefoot and bleeding when she stepped out of the trees and said, "Meet my mommy." And before the sun set that evening, Wyatt Granger would find himself standing inside a hidden cabin on his own land, staring at a woman the town had already judged guilty, realizing his quiet life was about to end. Wyatt hadn't spoken more than necessary in nearly 2 weeks. He kept to himself out on the north fence line, mending wire in the dry heat of Red Mesa Valley, counting the days since he'd last felt the need to answer to anyone. Silence was easier. Silence didn't ask questions about the past. So when he noticed the small figure watching him from beyond the split-rail fence, he almost convinced himself she wasn't real. The girl stood still as a fence post, dust coating her thin ankles, a narrow red streak running down from a fresh scrape she didn't seem to notice. She held a bundle of wild sage against her chest like something precious. But it was her eyes that made him straighten, watchful, steady, far too practiced for a child who couldn't have been more than 8. "You're the cowboy who lives alone," she said. Not a question. A fact. Wyatt rested his forearm on the fence. "That's so." His voice sounded rough from disuse. She nodded once. "My mommy needs help. She fell, and she can't stand up. I wasn't supposed to come get you." The last part wavered just slightly, but her chin lifted in defiance of her own fear. Wyatt studied her carefully. "What's your name?" "Clara May." "How old?" "8. Almost 9. She tilted her head. "You look sad." "Mama says sad men either turn mean or turn gentle. She told me to look at your eyes." That caught him off guard. "And what do my eyes say?" Clara considered him for a long second. Tired, she decided. But not mean. He exhaled slowly. "Where is she?" The girl hesitated, glancing back toward the tree line as if measuring whether she'd regret answering. "If I show you, you can't be mad." "Mad about what?" "About us being there." That made him pause. "Being where?" "On your land." She said it plainly, bracing for anger. Wyatt felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but surprise edged with curiosity. "Show me," he said at last, dropping his pliers into his tool belt. Clara didn't wait for him to reconsider. She slipped through a gap in the fence and headed toward the foothills east of the ranch, moving fast and sure-footed over rocks that made him wince just watching her bare soles. He followed close behind. The walk took less than 15 minutes, but the land grew quieter the farther they went, the brush thicker, the air scented faintly with wood smoke. He smelled it before he saw it: sage, drying herbs, something medicinal layered beneath the smoke. Then the cabin came into view, tucked low against the hillside as if trying not to exist. And beside the porch steps lay a woman. She was pale against the red dirt, dark hair fallen loose from a braid, one leg bent at an angle that made Wyatt's jaw tighten. Even flat on her back, her right hand rested near a hatchet. Clara rushed forward. "Mama, I brought him." The woman's eyes flew open, sharp and alert despite the pain etched across her face. "Clara," she hissed. "What did you do?" "You couldn't get up," the girl insisted, voice breaking now. "You've been on the ground forever." The woman dragged in a tight breath and focused on Wyatt. Her gaze was direct, unflinching, assessing. "Name," she demanded. "Wyatt Granger." Recognition flickered. Not friendly, not relieved, just knowing. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "And I suppose you should know I've been living on your land for 3 years. The admission hung heavy in the clearing. Wyatt glanced at the small vegetable patch half hidden beneath brush, the stacked woodpile, the thin trail worn into the dirt. 3 years. And he'd never known. "You planning on telling me why?" he asked evenly. Pain tightened her expression. "I was planning on setting my own ankle first." Clara looked between them anxiously. Wyatt stepped closer, hands visible. The woman's fingers curled tighter around the hatchet handle, but she didn't lift it. "It's dislocated," he said after a careful glance at her leg. "Needs setting. I can manage." "No, you can't." The words were firm, but not unkind. Their eyes locked, hers wary, his steady. Something in his expression must have eased her decision, because after a long second she released the hatchet and nodded once. "Eliza Rowan," she said, like offering her name was a calculated risk. "If you make it worse, I'll regret trusting you." "Fair enough," he replied. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and another beneath her knees. She weighed far less than she should have. Inside the cabin, shelves lined with neatly labeled jars filled the walls. Yarrow, mint, willow bark, everything precise and orderly. Survival arranged carefully. Clara hovered at the doorway as Wyatt set the ankle. Eliza didn't scream, though her knuckles went white gripping the blanket. Clara cried silently, tears slipping down without a sound. When it was done, Eliza sagged back against the pillow, breathing hard but controlled. Wyatt wrapped the joint tightly with clean strips Clara handed him from a wooden box of prepared splints. "You're a healer," he said quietly, glancing at the shelves. "I survive," she corrected. He looked at the child in the doorway, at the woman who refused to cry out, at the cabin hidden on land he thought he knew. The quiet he had built his life around shifted then, cracked open by a barefoot girl and 3 simple words. "Meet my mommy." By the 3rd morning, Wyatt understood that Eliza Rowan did not accept help. She endured it, and only because her ankle left her no other choice. He arrived at dawn out of habit now, boots quiet on the path, finding Clara already awake and perched on the porch rail like she'd been listening for him. Eliza's ankle had swollen deep purple, but she refused to stay in bed longer than necessary, directing Clara from her chair with clipped instructions about which herbs to grind and how long to steep willow bark until it turned the right bitter shade. "You're going to make that worse if you keep testing it," Wyatt told her as she tried to stand without bracing the wall. "It ain't your concern," she answered, jaw tight. "It is if you're limping around on my property," he replied calmly, stacking wood by the stove. That earned him the faintest twitch of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. He brought salt first because she'd asked for it plainly. The next morning, he left flour on the table as if it had wandered in by mistake. Sugar followed a day later. Eliza stared at each offering as though it might explode into obligation. "Kindness always costs something," she said quietly. "Not always," he answered. Clara, curled on the floor with a book so worn its cover had been re-sewn twice, looked up and declared, "Mama argues with help like it's contagious." Eliza shot her a warning glance, but Wyatt saw the exhaustion beneath it. He began noticing the careful order of the cabin, jars labeled in neat script, bundles of yarrow tied by season, dried mint hung above the stove. This wasn't hiding born of laziness. It was survival built with discipline. Clara spoke more freely than her mother. Children did when they sensed someone might listen. She told him about her father, Daniel Rowan, who died in a storm riding a half-trained horse that should never have left the stable. The owner had written a statement clearing Eliza, but Deputy Frank Delaney had buried it. Rumors had been easier than truth. "They said Mama didn't cry right at the funeral," Clara murmured while resetting a rabbit snare with small, steady hands. "Like there's a proper way to be sad." Wyatt felt something hard settle in his chest. It was Clara who told him about the night they left town. Men shouting, rocks through windows. Eliza standing barefoot in broken glass while hiding her daughter beneath the bed. "She carried me 3 hours," Clara said matter-of-factly. Her feet were bleeding, but she didn't make a sound. Wyatt didn't trust his voice enough to answer. The silence in his ranch house that night felt different, less chosen, more accusatory. On the 12th day, trouble rode in. Deputy Delaney and Mayor Thomas Whitlock appeared at Wyatt's barn with polite expressions that didn't reach their eyes. "We've noticed your tracks heading east most mornings," Delaney said. "Routine," Wyatt replied evenly. Whitlock glanced toward the foothills. "Nobody camps out there anymore." The message was clear. They suspected something. "Nothing on my land concerns you without a warrant," Wyatt answered. The deputy studied him a long moment, then tipped his hat in a gesture that felt more like warning than courtesy. They would be back. Wyatt rode straight to the hollow. Eliza knew something was wrong before he spoke. Fear sharpened her features instantly. "They're asking questions," he told her. The color drained from her face. "They'll come looking," she whispered. "Suspecting is enough." Clara moved closer to her mother, fingers curling into her skirt. Wyatt looked around the cabin, the garden carefully hidden, the shelves of medicine, the fragile piece built from nothing, and knew it would not survive a search driven by gossip. "Then they won't find you here," he said. Eliza's eyes lifted slowly. "What are you saying?" You don't understand what they'll do." "I understand enough." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Hiding looks like guilt to men who've already made up their minds. Standing in the open looks like truth." Eliza shook her head, but doubt had slipped into her certainty. "They'll try to take Clara," she said, and there it was, the real fear. Wyatt looked at the girl, at the way she never fully relaxed even now. Not if she's under my roof, he replied quietly. Silence fell between them, heavy as a gathering storm. The wind shifted through the trees, carrying the scent of rain and something inevitable. Helping them had started as neighborly decency. Somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely, a line he was no longer willing to let anyone cross. They rode into Red Mesa 2 mornings later with the sun barely clearing the rooftops, and by noon the entire town would know that Wyatt Granger had chosen a side. Eliza sat straight-backed in the wagon beside him, storm gray dress simple but deliberate, Clara wedged between them, holding both their hands like she was anchoring something fragile and enormous at the same time. Whispers began before the wheel stopped turning. Faces appeared in shop windows. Deputy Frank Delaney stepped out from the mercantile porch with the careful posture of a man who believed authority alone made him right. Mayor Whitlock hovered nearby, watchful and tight-lipped. Eliza did not lower her eyes. That, more than anything, shifted the air. Judge Harold Bennett waited inside the small territorial office, spectacles low on his nose, expression unreadable. "You understand what you're doing?" he asked him plainly. "Yes, sir," Wyatt answered. Eliza's voice followed, steady and clear. "We do." Outside, the murmur of gathering townsfolk thickened. Delaney entered halfway through the paperwork, protest already forming, but Wyatt was ready. From his coat pocket he removed a folded document, worn at the edges but intact, the stable owner's signed statement that had been buried 4 years earlier, the proof that Daniel Rowan's death had been an accident, not a crime. He placed it on the judge's desk without theatrics. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than shouting. Judge Bennett read every line. Delaney's face drained of color. Whitlock shifted, calculating. Truth, spoken plainly and supported by ink, has a way of steadying a room. "This should have been filed," the judge said at last, looking directly at the deputy. No one argued. The ceremony itself was brief. No flowers. No music. Just vows spoken without trembling. Wyatt's hand closed around Eliza's, and this time she did not pull away. Clara stood close enough that her shoulder brushed both of them, chin lifted high. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the sound of it felt less like romance and more like a door closing firmly against a storm. Outside, reactions split the street in two. Some curious, some skeptical, a few quietly ashamed. But no one stepped forward to object. Delaney left first, hat low over his eyes. By evening, word would spread that he'd be answering questions beyond Red Mesa. Back at the ranch, the house felt different. Not louder, not crowded, just fuller. Clara ran her hands along the kitchen table like she still couldn't believe it belonged to her. Eliza stood in the doorway a long moment before stepping fully inside, as if crossing an invisible threshold she had sworn never to approach again. "You don't have to thank me," Wyatt said quietly. "I wasn't going to," she replied, though her eyes were softer than they had been in months. Later, as dusk settled across the fields, Clara leaned against Wyatt's side and tested the word she'd been holding in all day. "Papa." He swallowed hard but answered easily. "Yes, ma'am." Eliza watched them from the porch, arms folded loosely now instead of defensively. The wind moved gently through the grass, no longer sounding like warning but like promise. It wasn't perfect. The town would take time. Trust would take longer. But the hiding was over. The door to the hollow cabin remained standing, tucked beneath the trees, a place that had once been survival. The ranch, however, was becoming something else entirely. Not just protection, not just strategy, a beginning. And for the first time in years, Eliza Rowan allowed herself to believe that staying might be braver than running.